Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Dennis Borsch. Nice to see you guys back again. And today I really wanted to talk about how I mastered openings. And this one is from my Dragon days, which starts with this opening of e4, c5, d6, takes, g6. Now this has been very famous for the game and match between Kasparov and Anand, with Kasparov famously using this to unbalance the legendary player and later world champion Vishy Anand. Now, I started studying this opening early in my childhood, and really you can't play this opening without previous knowledge. Now, if you are looking for any book suggestions, that'll be in the description below. Anyways, if you want to get better at it and if you want to master it, you do have to practice it a lot. I'm going to show you my game and how I kind of evolved into being a dragon player, as we say it in chess. Bishop e3, bishop g7, bishop c4, knight c6. And here my opponent actually is forced to play f3. And here I have a typical idea which can happen if the bishop is undefended. Most of the time, white would choose to play f3 and queen d2 first, but this move order, played by my opponent, gave me an extra opportunity of attacking that bishop. Now, if you're not educated enough in these openings, you will not know and not get why this happens. But however, my opponent would have played f3, knight c6, queen d2. This wouldn't have been a possibility as knight f5 would be strong. The knight on c3 is defended. So let's say queen b6, knight f5, queen b2, rook b1. You can take there first, it doesn't matter. And there's no queen takes c3 in this position because that's defended by the queen. However, the move order, Farago, uses f3, which allows this idea of queen b6. And the main point is the knight cannot really jump around. The bishop needs defense, and the knight on c3 is hanging. Knight f5, queen takes b2. This might seem similar and familiar from poison pawn openings beloved by Bobby Fischer, and it is in some ways like that. Takes king f8, and now you can see the difference. Now, white doesn't have time for rook b1, because in that case you can take here with a check and a double attack on those bishops, which means at the end of the day I will be up a piece. My opponent decided to go with king d2, and it's actually getting kind of tricky. I take the piece, a3. My opponent sort of suggests, hey, yes, you did get some material, however your queen is sort of trapped, and I am just a move away from capturing your queen via rook a2. Square on b4 is protected, the square on b5 is protected, b6 is protected. What are you hoping for? Now, if you're just watching this, you should try to figure it out your own, what I did here. Now, I realized as a young student of the dragon that you've got to get out that queen somehow. So I played knight a5. If rook a2, then the knight would just come in time for the rescue, give a check, and then I'll be in time to escape. Now here, I could even consider the move bishop e6, because if the queen is taken, I can give this check, and I'm winning back the material. Bit interesting. So my opponent played queen e2, saying, hey, if I can keep your queen boxed in, I can still trap you. Now with the extra move rook b1. So said bishop e6, hey, even if you can take my piece, I don't care. Bishop takes e6, rook c8. And this is a good move because I'm not wasting time, and instead of defending and trying to save my queen, I'm going for counteractive measures. I'm trying to put pressure on c3 and c2. Now you might ask me how did I come up with this move, bishop e6 or rook c8? Well, that really comes from learning how to play this opening and also kind of understanding the situation. I realize my queen on b2 is in big danger, and the only way to get out of this trouble is to counterattack. Now, did I improvise? Yes, and that's kind of the part of mastering an opening. Yes, you've got to have the basics of how to play it, therefore the books that you should study in your own time, but then comes the time to really master it with playing it and understanding the dynamics of the situation. Rook c8 was played, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8. And unbelievably enough, even though I'm down a whole rook, I have so many threats against my opponent king suddenly that I have full compensation for the rook. Now my opponent realizes that, doesn't even try to defend this knight, because in that case there's knight b3 check, king e2, and knight takes a1, and I win back the material with interest. My opponent decides to go rook b1, queen takes c3, king d1. And this is actually a typical dragon scenario. This is a typical dragon scenario. Black is down the exchange, but white has a bad pawn structure with pawn islands on a3, c2, and the bunch on the king side. However, this king is also a little bit exposed in the middle, and there's disconnect between the rooks, which I will try to exploit. Knight c4, bringing the knight in, pressing on the bishop and the pawn. Bishop c1, rook c7. Now, just because you have compensation doesn't mean you shouldn't value your own pawns. So before I start any action, I make sure that everything's defended. Queen d3. And here I play queen e5. Normally, whenever you're playing these dragon middle games, you want to avoid exchanging queens, especially as my king is much safer than this one on d1. Queen e5, just keeping the queen, and just notice that this piece on c1 is basically paralyzed and always has to watch out for tricks of knight b2 check. g3, d5. If your opponent is playing on the flank, you open it up in the middle, especially strong once my rook gets on the d file, setting up some deadly threats. f4, queen takes e4, rook e1, queen g2. Still avoiding the queen exchange. I want to get my knight to e4, so it makes sense to move the queen away. Also, you want to have the queens on the board if you're trying to checkmate your opponent. Bishop b2, knight b2, rook takes b2. I exchange this one off because I don't want counterplay against my king. If I would take here, white could consider taking on f6. Knight takes b2, rook takes b2, queen h2, c1, queen f2. So let's stop here for a second. I've got a bunch of pawns and a knight for the exchange. That would mean that the endgame is starting to be more and more favorable for me, so I would consider going for an endgame now on. f1, queen g2, rook e1, e6. And that's actually good technique. You want to connect your pawns so there are no weaknesses and no targets that my opponent can latch onto, which is very important. Queen e3, b6. Same idea. You're just making sure there are no weaknesses. Rook g1, queen h3, queen e5, rook c4. Centralizing and also preparing an idea of smoking out the queen on e5. King b1, queen h2, rook e4. Notice how slowly but surely I'm activating this rook, involving as many pieces as possible. Queen f1, rook e2. Now the tractor arrives on the second rank. Rook h1, queen g2, and I am willing to go into this endgame because if my opponent decides to go into that, I would have a threat of taking on g3, and in case of rook h3, I have this check, winning the exchange back, and with some extra pawns, this must be winning for the black player. Queen g1, h5. I'm getting ready for the endgame, so I'm pushing my pawns closer to this all-important square of h1 where the queening would occur. King a2. Now I switch back to attacking mode, immediately pouncing on the c2 square. e1, rook g2, c1, rook takes g3. Now this is the position we would call technically winning, so objectively the position's winning. But an objectively winning position is actually the hardest thing to win. So let's see how I won this game. Rook e1, queen c4, queen c5, rook g1. So I've got enough material now that every exchange gets me closer to a win. Rook takes g1, king a2, queen g4, queen e5. A very good move by my opponent, trying to at least put pressure and pin my king to this knight. Queen f5, queen c3, h4, king h7, sidestepping that pin, rook d3, and queen takes f4. And queen takes f4 might seem like a mistake, and the computer might say, hey, this is not the ideal move you should be looking for. However, being a human, you should look for the most efficient way of winning the game. Rook f3, queen c4, takes, rook takes f6, king g7, and let's stop right here and count. So black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns, while black has 2. However, all of my pawns on the king side are connected, and once they start rolling, they're unstoppable. This is actually a typical endgame you can get in the dragon, where a rook will be fighting against an armada of pawns. f1, g5. If you have pawns, you've got to start rolling with them. b2, g4. King c3, g3. And the other thing that's important is to remember that once your pawns reach the third or the second rank, then they are clearly worth a rook. And that's when there's only 2 pawns connected. However, I have 4 pawns, so that's even better. Rook g1, f5. Now, if my opponent would have tried to go rook h1, g2 would be a big mistake. Rook g1. Actually, even here, this should be winning. However, I could even consider going f5, because in case of rook h4, there's g2, and there's no rook g4 check taking my pawn on g2, because my f pawn is guarding that square, and there's no way back to stop the promotion. Rook g1, f5, d4, f4, e5, and now there is no stopping these 4 pawns, because if you take, then there's f3, and as I told you before, the pawns connected on the third are worth a rook, and they're more than likely to promote. King f3 was played, h3, rook d1, and king f6. And that's again another important thing. Even if it's a dragon endgame, bringing in your king is very important. Rook d8, e4 check. Just luring the king away and making it easier to promote. If I play g2, white can play king f2 and stop promotion for the time being. King takes f4, g2, rook g8, and h2. And because there is no way white can stop any of these pawns from promoting, you go here, I promote this way. White takes here, I promote with h1 queens. So in this position, after h2, my opponent resigned. White resigned. I really hope this was an enjoyable lecture of how to master this game. And if you're interested, again, check out the description. I will add the study that I used here and also the tactical puzzles that you can check out. So anyways, I hope you had a fun time and enjoy future lectures on the dragon. Hope you have a good day.